All right. Welcome to everyone. I will start us off. I'm Phoebe Morad, by the way, she, her, Executive Director of Lutherans Restoring Creation, and I am zooming in from the land of the Massachusetts people, who are the continuous and original Earth Keepers here. And I'm going to share the Lutherans Restoring Creation land acknowledgement as we get settled, which is a little bit more of a knowledge acknowledgement. As we live, work, and worship in the land that is now called the United States, Lutherans Restoring Creation recognizes that we do so on land that was stolen from Indigenous peoples. As we are called to restore creation, we are also called to restore right relationship with one another. As we join in this holy vocation of loving our neighbor, we honor all our Indigenous siblings who have been companions of the lands, waters, and beings of Turtle Island since time immemorial. We charge our community to learn about the original and continuous stewards of the land upon which we exist. We lament legacies of violence, cultural genocide, and displacement of Indigenous communities, committing ourselves to hearing and speaking the truth of that history and its ongoing effects. May we gather faithfully in mind, body, and spirit, so that we may mend what has been broken and embody Christ's gospel of abundant life. Welcome to you all. I am going to start us off this evening. Since we are talking about finances and the word wallet came up and money and very practical, tangible things, I'm going to try to set the stage a little bit wider, broader. And I'm going to share my screen. There is a book that maybe some of you have been on these calls before, might have heard me or seen me mention before. Can you all see this little acorn? Is that showing okay? Yes, okay. So I'm going to share a reading from this book that I'm afraid I don't think you can find anymore, but you should try to find it in some great old bookstores. Of Earth and Sky, Spiritual Lessons from Nature. It's a compilation of many great works from Thomas Becknell, who writes this, who I wanted to, oops, that's a craft thing, project of my daughter's. There we go. This is what I wanted to share with you, and I'll explain why in a moment. Every chapter is set up to think about certain qualities that we can, lessons that we can learn from nature. And this segment is from the chapter on love. All things love each other, wrote Ernesto Cardenal in his Meditations on Love and Spirituality. Everything in nature seeks to transcend its own limitations, to go beyond the barriers of its individuality, to meet with a thou to which it can give itself. This is not to say that plants and animals love as humans love, for they simply live according to their nature without reflection. Nature in its total embrace, through all of its complex interconnections, is one vast expression of love, because it yearns to surrender to something beyond itself. St. Paul puts it this way in his epistle to the Romans: the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. And when I read this today, because yes, I do these things last minute, as I read this today, it was the first time that reading comes up a lot in creation care work, groaning as in the pains of childbirth. And it wasn't until reading it in this context that I realized how important it is that childbirth is mentioned here. The idea that so much of creation, so much of our fellow beings on the planet are always so focused on the next generation. I mean, I was watching a monarch butterfly the other day and so excited that one showed up to my milkweed because I didn't cut it all down. And I'm watching it, realizing that, thinking about the travels that we know monarchs go through, all just to deposit some eggs and then die. I mean, how many creatures out there just make sure they make the next generation and then they're out. That's it. Drop the mic. They're done. And it strikes me that a lot of humans, and especially within our culture, we often are thinking of our offspring, but we think of it as our individual kin that are within our grasp and what we can hand over as far as a better life for the next generation, but that next generation typically that we can see. And I just ask us to think of the next generation as much larger than, you know, your grandchildren or your children. To think of the next generation, not just who you can share your wealth with or who you can make sure to pass down, you know, a better life to as far as tangible assets. But what we're asking all of us to do and all of us to think of is how to offer a better place for all of us to live. So yeah, with that visual, I will hand it over to Gabrielle. Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for making this evening possible. You gathered everybody together. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gabrielle they, she, and I am the outreach coordinator for Lutherans Restoring Creation. Simply here to introduce our very special guest, Amy Brooks Paradise, who is the North American organizer for GreenFaith. And if you're not familiar with GreenFaith, we love being partners with them. They organize people of many different faiths from around the globe for a livable future, as Phoebe led us there in spiritual a reflection about thinking about the future generations, not only of our own species, but of all. So I'm really excited to welcome Amy, as she's just a really vibrant, energizing person to work with. And I've gotten to work with Amy thinking about how communities of faith can think about removing power and money from fossil fuel projects or divesting. And that is really important work that I am really energized by. It is really important work for all of us to do. That being said, it is not actually the focus of our call tonight, although things are in the works. So I'm going to pop a link in the chat. If that is why you're on this call tonight, stick with us because we have lots of good things to say. But Amy is going to lead us in thinking a little bit about beyond wealth or investments, how we can think about a better future with our finances. And I know this talk has morphed a couple of different times, and I'm just really excited to hear from Amy. So without any further ado, go ahead, Amy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for that lovely introduction. And thank you both, Gabrielle and Phoebe, for inviting me to be on this call. And I'm just looking at all the names, and I'm just so honored to be in your presence this evening. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. We're a small group, so if something gets confusing or I lose, like you can't hear me or anything like that, please just speak up so we can all stay together. I am coming off a fairly long trip with my family. As you were talking, I was just reminded of why I do this work. I know we're all here because somehow this work touches us. And so part of my story is that I have a beautiful daughter that we adopted from China, and we are just coming back from her heritage tour. And so the idea of generations and family and continuing to pass things on really resonates with me. And that is what got me into this work. I will say that I've always cared about the earth. I've always been an outdoors person. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. I have farmers in my family. So we've always had connection to the land, but it is the generational piece that really kind of pushed me over the edge. Almost, oh boy, it's been a while now, into this work, but didn't come to GreenFaith formally as a staff person until 2018. And, you know, like so many faith communities, I've been a part of these conversations around, you know, community gardens and you know, reducing our carbon footprint and all the things that we've been doing for more than, I'm going to say more than 30 years now, in terms of our fight and our struggle to help people understand how they can be better stewards of the planet. But as I came into my work with GreenFaith, there was a shift going on in the wider climate community, and it was beginning to focus on systemic change. What did it really mean to change systemically? And as I live in a very wealthy community of Charlotte, North Carolina, that's known for banking and insurance and really living a very lovely life. Finance became the focus. And I'll tell you, I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and I did not ever go into ministry to talk about money. And yet here I am. And as it turns out, our faith traditions actually have quite a bit to say about money. But it's also a touchy topic, as I'm sure you're well aware, and it can be difficult to have to talk about it with people, and it can be even more difficult to get people to organize around it publicly. And yet that is what GreenFaith has really dug in on as one of our major campaign focuses. We believe pretty strongly that all of our faith traditions, and we can find the scriptures, and I'll share a few tonight, have quite a bit to say about money and the ethical use of money, and that faith that only happens on a Sunday or a Friday or a Saturday is not as powerful as a faith that's out there in the world. And so after probably 3 solid years of working on this, GreenFaith just released a report of sorts that kind of brings our thinking together. And so rather than using the previous slideshows and presentations and things that I've thought about over the last couple of years, I thought what I would do tonight would be to simply share this report with you. I will take you through it. We won't have time to read it all. It's 21 pages long, but it does have some pretty photographs, and there are, places where you can just kind of dig into the top line stuff. And so I'm just going to go through, I'm just going to take you through this, and then at the end, I'm going to share the report with you because it is out there in the world, and then we'll also have time for a conversation. So I would like to be done talking by 25 of, maybe a couple minutes after that, sometime between 25 and 20 of. So if someone will give me like a 10-minute mark and a 2-minute mark to help me kind of move this along, I would be super appreciative. Does this sound good to everybody? Do I have your buy-in that we can do this together tonight? Yay, good. I'm sorry we don't have time to go around. I'd love to hear everybody's story. I don't think I know anyone. I think everyone here is new to me except maybe one of you. So it's really delightful to see some new faces. All right, let me share my screen here and see if I can find my good report. Yes, this is where I want to be. So I'm just going to start with some fun photographs. These are some photographs of some of the actions. Not all of these are GreenFaith actions. Some are actions of other groups, but these are just fun and beautiful photographs of people of faith taking action on fossil fuels, but particularly on banks and investment companies. So this one I think actually happened up in Canada. I believe this is Rochetta, and this is a tribal leader, and they're talking to no, actually it's not in Canada. I'm thinking of a different one. This one was Citibank, so it's here in the US. This is a sign that we painted here in Charlotte because we've always focused on Bank of America. So we tell them, Banks of America, stop digging our graves. This was a funeral procession we did. This was an action at BlackRock. So people of faith coming together, and we always try to do our work in line with frontline communities. So you also see a few photographs here of people in communities that are directly and deeply impacted by what's happening with fossil fuels and the financing of fossil fuels in their communities. So the name of this report is Sacred Planet, Stained Profits: Why Religious Communities Must Pressure Banks to Phase Out Finance for Fossil Fuels while Upscaling Investment in Clean Energy. Now, one of the ways to put pressure is to just simply move your money, but that sometimes takes us out of that public discourse. And so part of what GreenFaith is trying to do is not just move the money, but to make sure that the reason people are upset is out there, that people are talking about it, that people are arguing about, like, why should we do this? And, isn't church supposed to be on Sunday morning? And I don't want to talk about this publicly. And we're saying, no, we need to have this conversation. This needs to be a global conversation. And people of faith really do have something to say and to contribute to this. So it's great to move your money. I'm in the process of doing mine. I've been doing it for a while. I know that that's something you all have talked about and done. But we also want to continue to get people to talk about the issue, about what's really happening, and to be public about it. So that's what this report's going to dig into. So here are the contents. There are 5 sections. The first one is, what's going on? Like, what is happening? We have a climate crisis, and what does that mean? And what is the demand? How do we need to respond to that? The second section really digs into banks in particular. They're failing ethically, financially, and I would say morally, to address the climate crisis. So there's a section on what's happening there. The third section is where we really get into the religious piece of things, teachings on the ethical use of money. 4 is faiths in action, are a transformative force, like why it matters and what we can do. And then here are some things we can do. So I'm going to kind of take us through this. And what I would like to do is just, I'll go to each section, and I'll probably just try to highlight some key phrases that we can focus on. If you try to read the whole thing, you'll get super frustrated. I promise you, you will get this afterwards and you can read it at your leisure. But I want to give us enough to have a conversation tonight. So I'm going to skip over the introduction because it's kind of what I just said. And because we're people of faith, it's always great to just start by grounding ourselves a little bit in our faith. And what are religions for but to teach us how to understand the world around us and to respond to it in an ethical, moral, and faithful way. And so I don't want to kind of cherry pick and drop scripture and not have a chance to talk about it. But we do have things here for each tradition. And since this is a Lutheran group, the one that we have here is from St. Teresa of Avila. And she writes, we must always be prepared to understand the times in which we live, for the service of God and the salvation of souls depend upon it. So section 1, what the climate crisis demands. So as I just said, our faiths teach that we have to understand the time so we can apply our teachings and live in Christian terms with compassion, love, and justice. Those are all terms that we are familiar with, as are many other traditions. And so what we did is kind of broke down what's happening. And one thing we know is that based on the world's best scientific studies, the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015 said we have to limit the amount of carbon we put in the air so that we do not raise the overall global temperature more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've known this for a long time. In order to make that happen, we know that we cannot have more new fossil fuel projects, and that eventually we have to phase out everything, but certainly we cannot continue to develop fossil fuel projects. But we can't just be without energy, right? So if we're going to phase out fossil fuels, we have to make sure that people have access to clean, affordable energy. So that leads us to this idea that we must transition to new kinds of energy that will give people access, that will be sustainable, that will be economical, and still give us what we need. So this section basically talks about these things. Science has shown what it means. We have to meet this goal. Religious organizations and communities around the world have unequivocally recognized that it is imperative that we stay below this. So this is the sort of why we're doing this, what's happening, and what we need to do. The final piece of this is the financial sector really does have an essential role to play. It both finances fossil fuels, it could stop doing that, and it could also upscale support for renewables, but they're not doing it. So this brings us to the next section, which is going to be about banking. And we want to start again religiously thinking about religions talk to us about when we know that there's a harm. If we continue to do that, we know that this is not good behavior. This is bad behavior. And again, every religious tradition says something about this. And so this is where we focus in on the banks, because they are failing to address this crisis. And they're doing it in different ways. One way is that they have, despite the Paris Climate Accords, since that time committed almost $7 trillion to fossil fuels. They have not adopted any policy or shown any real evidence of a commitment to phase it down, let alone phase it out, but just to phase it down. Unfortunately, US banks are the leading banks in the world when it comes to financing the fossil fuel industry. And you'll notice this report focuses in particularly on Citibank. All of the banks, all of our big banks are involved. I happen to focus on Bank of America because in Charlotte, we have the headquarters here. But this report may say a lot about Citi because there is an entire program going on right now this summer, and I don't know if people have heard of it, but it's called Summer of Heat. And there's a lot of pressure that's being put on Citi because of because it's so far ahead of many of the other banks, and they're all bad, but I mean, all the big banks, international big banks, but it ranks as the world's largest financier of fossil fuel expansion since the Paris Climate Agreement. And so for that was one of the reasons it was picked as a target. But you can also see that others are causing problems. So they've continued to allocate more finances to the fossil fuel companies. There's some interesting statistics in here about how, where we really need to be versus where we are. We need to be at a 4-to-1 ratio, renewables to fossil fuels, and we're not even at a 1-to-1 ratio. In fact, they're still financing fossil fuels more than sustainable energy. So here's an example. Between 2016 and 2022, only 7% went to renewables. And Citibank and JP Morgan, two of the top, allocated as little as 2%. Here's another way that it's problematic. They are actually at times obstructing progress. They do other activities. Researchers have found they routinely back anti-climate industry association lobbying efforts. They fail to adopt best practices in corporate climate change policies, and they avoid pressuring companies to whom they lend. So these are all ways that they could be supporting this transition, and they're actually actively working against it, or at the very least are passive about it. They also at times do what we call greenwashing, which is to obstruct what's really happening by not telling the whole story. They also try to undercut what climate activists are doing. So this is a very long section. I'm not going to dig into it. There's a lot of things here. But they use language like, oh, it's unrealistic, or that we're being naive and misguided in our calls for change. We don't think that's true. We think that there's a lot that they can do. So that it talks about the arguments that they raise and why it fails. Probably the biggest one is that just from an economic standpoint is they refuse to admit how generally profitable renewables have become. In fact, there's been some research that says, the financial fuel industry is losing money. And the only reason that it stays, quote, profitable is because it's so much underwritten by our federal government, which is a whole other problem. So they want to focus on short-term profitability over long-term sustainability. And there is profit to be made in that long-term sustainability. And you're probably also aware that there are a lot of costs that they don't end up having to count. So there's another in sum section here, which goes over what I just shared with you. And we believe that their arguments fail on ethical, humanitarian, and ecological levels. One piece I haven't even touched on here, but will be near and dear to your heart as people of faith and justice, is all of the information out there about how these communities that are living adjacent to these petrochemical plants are being impacted. And so you have in here a quote from Roishetta Ozain, the founder of the Vessel Project in Louisiana, where she talks about even her own children becoming ill from living next to these plants. Citigroup is hurting our communities, especially the Black community of the Gulf South. I've had a chance to meet Sharon Levine personally. She talks about having a funeral at least every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. They have these numerous petrochemical plants, all within a 10-mile radius of where she lives. And they continue to try to even build new plants. And they've had a big fight against a new petrochemical plant by Formosa Plastics. So that's a death sentence for us. So that kind of sets up the problem. Now we want to talk a little bit about how our religious teachings on the ethical use of money specifically can help us be grounded and strong in our response. So here, this section starts out by saying we recognize the power of financial profit in decision-making of banks in relationship to the climate crisis. And they argue that they have to invest at a greater level than renewable energy because fossil fuels are more profitable. And we just say, nope, as people of faith, we disagree. We have a lot to say about money. We are pretty remarkably consistent in our warnings about the destructiveness of greed. I mean, we're familiar with that. As people of faith, we've heard different things. You know, it's easier for it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. I mean, these sound like cute, quaint things, and you know, we can kind of go, oh yeah, we understand. But this is like the real life impact of us not paying attention to that. And I use us collectively because I feel like we can all make our own individual decisions, and I believe we're all doing, as people of faith, the best we can, but we're part of a system that's kind of set up to work against us. And so in some sense, we're all, you know, our hands are all stained to some extent because it's almost impossible to live in this society and be free of it. So we're not trying to propose a simplistic or moralistic rejection of profit, but we do want to move beyond the debate of the current financial system that says it doesn't have to think about this. We do believe it bears responsibility for the climate crisis and for the suffering and ecological devastation. And of course, as people of faith, we are taught to be compassionate to those who are suffering, as well as restraining our own greed. So there are 2 ways that we can also think about this. And again, we really dig into some Christian and Buddhist teachings. I love this line. I had never had anybody count this for me. I was like, wow, okay. We hear a lot about sex and we hear a lot about heaven and hell, but there are 288 gospel verses, or 1 out of 10, that deal with money, which is more than sex, heaven, and hell combined. I thought that was wild. You know, I just quoted you a scripture here, some others from our New Testament that talk about, you know, the dangers of not being careful with our money or loving it more than we love our neighbor, or, you know, we can think of all kinds of ways that shows up in our lives, consciously, unconsciously. So we want to think about how people of faith, so we have the teachings, but we also want to think about what happens when we put those teachings in action. And of course, we have this long and beautiful tradition in our faith coming out of the Jewish prophets and into the New Testament about how faith in action is a powerful and transformative force. And I love that word transformative because I think that's really what people of faith are all about. There's this great quote by Gus Speth, who was an author and a lawyer and an environmental activist. And I don't have it memorized. I should, because I refer to it so often. But he writes about, you know, I used to think that, you know, education and 30 years of good science would convince everybody about the climate crisis and we would fix the problem. And then he said, I was wrong. The real problem is greed and ignorance. And I forget what the other word is that he uses. Apathy, maybe. Greed, ignorance, and apathy. And he said, those are spiritual issues, and I don't know anything about those. And so I just love that because I think it's a clear call to people of faith to bring that transformative force to the forefront. And again, we've cited scriptures so that people can kind of ground themselves spiritually in thinking about this, that our faith is not meant to be, my line always is, you never hear about Jesus's private ministry. You always hear about his public ministry. I mean, we are called to be out in public with this work, I believe. So the section 4, we're not going to go into this too much. I'm just going to give you 3 examples. You can read more about them, but you already know all about them. In the 70s and 80s, we overturned a very unjust government system that was based on, that had, by using economic force. I mean, we all know what happened in South Africa. And so this, talks about that, talks about how we used money and economics to pressure a government to stop doing what they were doing, and it worked. This happened again in the early 2000s when many faith groups came together and said, look, you cannot expect poor people to pay back debt with interest. Like, it's completely not going to work. And we know this is true because we know that there's Jubilee in the Bible. You forgive the debts. You don't just keep holding on to them. And so again, worked very hard to support our developing countries by forgiving debt. Again, a great effort that involved people of faith. And finally, we are hoping to use this, we have been, and we want to continue to use economics to challenge what's happening in the climate movement. So it started out with the fossil fuel divestment movement, which happened in the 2010s, 11s, up through 2013. The largest group to divest proportionally was people of faith. They did a better job than any other segment of society and divesting from fossil fuel companies. And I know that that's work that is still happening. Some were able to divest completely. Others maybe didn't get quite as far as they had hoped. And so now here we are at this place where we say, well, I don't have any investments in Exxon. I don't have any investments in these different things. And you all guys already all know this because I know you've been working on moving your money, because we know that the banks and the investment groups that we use are still invested. And so if we have money in a bank, if we have money in certain investments, then we may very well be contributing greatly to this crisis. So we want to be able to help people understand that and understand that people of faith have a role in this. And I love this, this quote by Desmond Tutu. Sometimes people want to be neutral. And I'm like, yeah, okay. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So depending on what perspective we come from, it looks very different. And for our people and our planet that do not have the kind of power to move that elephant's foot, they are looking at those of us who have some power, relatively speaking, to stand up with them. So this brings us to our last section. What can we do? And one of the things that we are working on for this summer of heat is to really focus in on city. I mentioned this before. This is part of a larger effort that we're hoping to build. Like, I don't want us to stay stuck just on city forever. We want to build this financial faith movement to include not just Citibank, but Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase. Those are the big 4 here in the US. I've got some folks up in Canada working on the Royal Bank of Canada. I'm going to be meeting with them next week. And then, of course, we have those big investment companies that we've all heard about, BlackRock, and I'm going to blank on the other one right now. Oh, Vanguard. How could I miss Vanguard? To just say, again, if you are with these groups, even if you've cleaned your money up and you aren't invested in those specific things, do we still want to be doing business with a company that, is helping with one hand, but making the problem continue over here? It's part of us, a larger system that we don't want to condone, and we want to figure out how it could look different. So for this particular campaign, we have a letter to Citibank that people of faith can sign, but there's more that we can do. And this is where we really start, becoming really active in the public square. Are you willing to go to your bank? Is your congregation willing to go to its bank and talk about our concerns, especially if we're banking with one of those banks? But even if you're not, you can still go to a big bank and say, hey, I'm really concerned, that's what I'm doing here in Charlotte, Bank of America. Every time we do an action, we sign one of our letters and we take it to another bank manager. Hey, we just want to let you know, we're really concerned about, how you're showing up in our community. And then we also really want to encourage and support people in organizing their community of faith to take part in public action. And this week, in fact, today, there was a public action in New York. This is Faith Week for the Summer of Heat. And I heard last that 28 people were arrested on purpose to engage in civil disobedience. So this was something they prepped and trained for. Other people were there supporting them, did not get arrested, to express concern to city. This has been going on all summer, and you may well be aware of it. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. But we're going to have a family-friendly event on Thursday, which will not involve an arrestable action. And we invite anyone in the greater metro New York area to come and join us. And then finally, we are going to continue to support this and help communities of faith take public action, even in their home areas. So if you have a city bank in your community, you could do this, but you could also put pressure on other banks. I mean, they did something earlier this summer with Bank of America, and we showed up at our local one at the same time. So there's lots of ways that we can begin to get active and engage and be part of this pressure campaign. And just want to say, if you haven't received the information, I'd love to get you connected to what's coming out with some of the emails and so forth from Stop the Money Pipeline. Several of the main organizers of this Summer of Heat are being repeatedly targeted and harassed by Citibank. They've started fabricating erroneous charges against them. One person's been arrested 3 times. I think a couple of them now have a restraining order each time they get dismissed because they're erroneous. But clearly the bank is feeling the pressure because this kind of response shows that they are feeling the heat. And while it might sound like a lot to say somebody got arrested 3 times, as I said earlier, they're prepped, and we're going to continue to push at this level as well as these other levels. So there are a couple of other pieces of information in here about some other groups. So Sisters of St. Joseph's of Peace have been working for years on city. They've been doing shareholder advocacy. Different people are, focusing on different ways of doing this. Another really great thing that happened just this last year was the largest Christian charity in the United Kingdom left Barclays. And that was a really powerful move on their part. So people are taking action. People are feeling the pressure, and we want to keep doing this. So I'll just close with this fun picture. And I think I'm within my time frame and I will stop talking and stop sharing so I can see your faces. Would love to be able to open this up for a conversation, for questions, but I'll turn it back over to you, Gabrielle, to kind of facilitate however you want to do this next part. I will work on getting you the link to this report if you don't already have it. And I also have a couple of other links I can share with you before we go.
And I would like to say, I know I mentioned that I'd stop recording, but I realize that a lot of your questions might be nice to hear. So if anybody wants to ask questions later off recording, just privately message me. But otherwise, I'd love to open it up while we record. Go ahead, Gabrielle. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to hear questions. I know, Phoebe, you also had something that we wanted to lift up the New England Synod because they have been doing a lot of this sort of finance work.
Yeah, I will start because I'm pretty sure that's what might be going through a lot of people's mind is this is a lot and eager to see what it is you've been sharing, Amy. But at the same time, how can we make it work? You know, that last slide that you showed, the last few pages about, okay, what can we do? The New England Synod really put together a great kind of primer. I'll share the link in here for you as to how you could go to your church and specifically give them some ideas about what to do. And now we have something else we can add to this list, which is what Amy just shared. But as far as how to go about thinking about where are your assets, why you would even bring this up in church, they have a really great one-pager. And so this is really helpful to just start off with, so you're not starting with a blank slate in front of you. So I will share that in the chat so you can see what one synod happened to do. The other thing that I just wanted to lift up too, oh, when I see Lisa's hand, is just to mention the fact that, like, when I mentioned to my my mom tonight that we were going to be talking about money and how we use our money, and her first reaction is, "What money?" And I think sometimes with a lot of our congregations, you know, individually, we might think what money, but especially as congregations, to recognize the fact that there are a lot of congregations and synods simply just really scared about not being able to go forward, not having enough money. So the idea of people of faith having assets and having a voice in the world of wealth is just not something we think about. And to Amy's point that no, we are heard, those, you know, those real true to life examples of how people of faith communities have been heard in this arena is really critical to lift up, even if your church doesn't happen to have investments. But also to remember, Amy, you might be able to fact check me on this, but I believe that the world's religions, if they were considered a country, it would be the fourth largest economy on the planet. So especially once you start to take in the idea of land and those kind of assets, people of religious and organizations have a lot of wealth. So Amy, do you know what that it's a number?
I am
sorry.
not sure of that fact, but I love it, and I'm going to
I
read
will look it up.
because that is really powerful to think about. Yeah, I think it is important that right now in communities of faith, you know, we've just come through COVID. People are feeling very stretched and stressed, but we still do have a lot of assets. And I think the other piece of this is whether we have the assets or not, people of faith globally are at about 80%. And so we don't necessarily just have to have the assets. We want to show up as local speakers and prophets of our concern about how the system is working, because we see that it's not working. We know that it's not working. We know that people are suffering. We know the planet is struggling. And so whether we have the money or not, we still have a voice. And that's really important. And a message.
I see that Lisa has her hand raised. Lisa, do you want to pop in here?
Sure. So when you were speaking, Amy, you mentioned a study that compared profitability of investments in renewables with investments in fossil fuels if you kind of subtract off all the subsidies. If you could provide that reference, if it's not in the report itself, I would very much like to see that. Thank you.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. I haven't seen it in a while. I will research it for you and I will get it to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I am curious with those, for a question for all of you, have any of you had either a conversation, like a coffee hour conversation about where your church investment's going, or a conversation with your church council? Have you ever tried, I especially want to hear from you if you've failed, but have you ever tried this kind of conversation in your church community? Robert, I don't know if you want to answer that, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go. I know that Lisa and I, a couple of years ago, did a program that dealt with greening your finances for organizations and individuals. I took care of the part that dealt with it with organizations because I managed the finances for my church. And I know you say you manage the finances for a church. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, but my particular organization has a shopping center. We have uh, what do you call it? Investment monies, a B&R fund. It's rather large, and we wrote a what do you call it? An investment policy for the church to use for anybody who's involved with our finances. Our brokerage get a copy of that says these are the things we will not invest. These are the things we will invest. If there's an opportunity for being involved in energy, if there is a socially acceptable energy source that can be invested in, we want that to be where the investment goes rather than fossil fuels. It's one of those kind of things. That's the way we've stated it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate you sort of digging into that. You know, one of the things that this challenges us to do is to understand how money works in our society, and it's very obtuse often. It's difficult to know where the money actually is. I've had to learn a whole lot about that, and so there are socially responsible investing. I don't know if platforms is the right word. I mean, we hear a lot about ESG, which is environmental sustainable governance. And it's the thing that kind of falls into socially responsible investing as a larger category. And it is supposed to focus on these non-fossil fuel options, whether it's replacing them with a more renewable energy source, or if it's just taking the money out, you know, that ends up being individual decisions, or the way that the set of funds are put together. I mean, I think most of us know that, like, you buy mutual funds and there's like all this stuff in there. Like, you have to like sit here and pick out each one. Like, is Vanguard in there? Is, you know, like it's hard work. And so finding somebody who can do that with you or for you is super helpful if you have that kind of money, that you know, need somebody to do that for you. I don't want to assume that people have, you know, huge portfolios here, but even if you have a relatively small one, it gets quite messy quickly. So pulling that out is important. And again, even if you aren't invested anymore, still having a voice, because clearly, you know, if we arm ourselves with the statistics about what's happening, there's still a lot of money that's being invested poorly. So while I may not be any longer a customer of Vanguard, I may still want to put pressure on Vanguard and say I left, or, you know, I am still a person of faith standing up and saying that your investment portfolio is dangerous to our planet. And I am going to talk about that publicly. I see Lisa has her hand up again, but also someone new. How do we want to go next?
Lisa was first.
Okay, Sharon, thank you. I wasn't paying enough attention to know who was first. I put a link in the chat. Since this is a call of Lutherans, everyone on this call will have heard of Thrivent. Thrivent offers impact managed portfolios. So if you are comfortable working with Thrivent because you're a Lutheran and everyone knows Thrivent as a Lutheran, they do offer impact managed portfolios. I put the link in the chat. I do not personally work with Thrivent. I prefer to manage my own investments myself. It's just a personal preference. But for those who might be comfortable working with Thrivent, they do provide this service.
And I think one of the questions I have with all of these companies, not just Thrivent, is that the primary thing that they offer people? Do they have other funds in there that are still invested in fossil fuels? So, you know, one of the things that I think about is it's great that you have this environmentally sustainable investment piece. But again, if you're still over here invested in Exxon, I'm struggling here.
Well, and I'm not going to sit here and say that all of Thrivent's investments are green. They're not.
Right. I think that's one of the things that when you really start to get into following the money, and I'm actually working on a curriculum with 2 other people where we're outlining all of this stuff, and it's really it's interesting because, how bad is too bad? All of them to some extent, have their feet a little bit. There are very few that are so clean, but we're working on it and we're continuing to put pressure and say, we want you not only to offer this, but we want you to be clean. We want you to get rid of all of it.
Well, and I think from our perspective as Lutherans, since Thrivent, well, I mean, they changed the name quite a few years ago, but it used to be an exclusively Lutheran organization. It has not been an exclusively Lutheran organization for some years now, but we may be interested to try to influence that organization by coming in and saying, okay, we're interested in the impact managed portfolios. And if they see that part of their business growing, well, they're not stupid, right? So I just offer it. I recognize that no, it's not like some of the funds that are 100% sustainable investments. I mean, it's not. But we as Lutherans may be interested to try to influence Thrivent.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that there are people in other groups that are Lutheran that have worked on this. I don't know enough about Thrivent myself to be able to speak knowledgeably about where that is, but I do know that there's been pressure put on Thrivent, and maybe this is one of the results. Jump over to Sharon. You're still on mute, Sharon.
Yeah, I just unmuted. I lost you, but I got you back. There's two things I'm thinking about here. One is as our churches, our synods, give money away also in grants, in gifts, whatever it is. Perhaps we need information or reminders that we need to be careful to whom we give. Do they support our mission, our vision, our push for making this a sustainable world? And I think we need to do that. That's one part. And I'm sure that if you don't have literature, you'll be developing it. The other part is so many churches in this individual area, I'm thinking maybe 4 of them, are all facing financial difficulties. And then I've gone from one church with financial difficulties when we merged together with another one, and we thought we were going to be fine, and we're not necessarily going to be fine. And as I look at that, we seem locked into, I'm so worried today, I cannot think about where my investments are today. And maybe we need some type of encouragement and push and public relations efforts to say, you are still here. Today is right now, and you can make a difference right now. Don't give up. You're still here.
Well, one of the things that I used to say when I pastored a church, I don't know if it will resonate with you all or not, but this was a small congregation, mostly older folks, and I put it in terms of legacy. Like, what is our legacy? Because I'm an older folks now too. What is our legacy to future generations? What is the church for? What are we trying to build here? Who are we creating this or recreating this space or this building or this mission for? And sometimes helping think about, there's that great book about building a cathedral, or that image of building a cathedral. Most people who built cathedrals never got to see them to completion because it took, a couple of centuries sometimes to build those big cathedrals. So we're building for tomorrow, and we're building for a future that we can't see. And so thinking about not getting stuck in the panic of the moment, and to take that step back and say, what is this for? And are we thinking about it in those terms rather than just trying to think about getting through the next quarter? Because that's actually some of the thinking that's kind of got us into this situation: short-term profitability over long-term sustainability in the financial sector, right? And in the fossil fuel sector. If we're more interested in just the next quarter than we are where we're going to be 30 years from now, it ends up being short-sighted and dangerous to us.
Thank you, Amy. And one thing too that I want to lift up that I learned early on from Keith Mundy as a stewardship person, is just how important abundance, the conversation of abundance is. And in this, when you talk about legacy, we have an abundance of time. As you said, we're not thinking about the next quarter. We're thinking about the next generation. So again, if we can think of our abundance, and and recognize the relative abundance that we do have here. I think seeing things on a global scale really helps. So, and I do appreciate that Keith answered my question, but if anybody else also has any feedback as to whether or not they've found letters to the editor. Amy, I know you all with GreenFaith are amazing at getting local press to any events. Like if you do have a standout at a church, you're great at teaching people how to make sure people take pictures and get in their local papers. So yeah, I'm curious if anybody, I don't know, is willing to do that. And I think if we want, it does totally depend on where you are for sure. I'm curious too, if anybody wants to try that and give each other a challenge to see if we can do that. That might be a fun thing to do over the season of creation, to be able to after church show up at a bank with the card that we all signed or something to that effect. So if anybody's willing and interested in doing that, we can have some kind of accountability circle doing that.
And GreenFaith would be happy to support, like with resources or, let us know, because we want, the other thing that's really important to us is, and we were talking about this before we got on the call, Phoebe, is there are so many small groups working in these different areas, and they often feel isolated and alone, and they don't get to see the big impact because it is slow in coming, and it is hard to see because, in fact, our media has not done a great job of covering the climate crisis, except as like, oh my God, here's another, we have tornado watchers, right? I mean, we sort of take it on that level rather than thinking about what's happening underneath scientifically or morally or structurally or systemically. But anyhow, so one of the things that GreenFaith is trying to do is keep in touch with the different groups and help share the wealth and the information and the successes so that we don't feel isolated, because that's how we build power.
Mm-hmm.
Is when we come together and are working together on this, and we're staying in connection with each other. And it's like, we know the Lutherans are moving on this, on Thrive, and how can we support them? Like we've done stuff with Vanguard, with the Quakers. How do we kind of push together rather than each person trying to push like their own boulder? Like, let's get the big one and push it together. I see that Sharon has her hand up, and I also want to make sure before we go that I drop this link into the chat. We have an action hour coming up on Thursday. If you'd like to come to our action hour, it will be an hour. We will get together. We will talk a little bit about Citibank. Then we will sign the letter. We will make some calls and we'll contact some friends. And it's just a fun way as a group to come together and take action. And then at the end, we kind of celebrate, we had 50 letters and 70 people were contacted and we made 120 calls or whatever that works out to be, just in that hour. And it's just kind of a fun thing to do. We're doing it at 4:00 Eastern time. I'm going to drop the link here. I think it will work. Let me see. Hopefully this will open up for you. And you can sign in and come and join us. I'm trying to open it up right now. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yeah. And, just meet some other people doing this work. It's happening at the same time as the fun, family-friendly action in New York City in front of Citibank. So maybe we'll even get some news from the ground. If we get a video, we'll play it. Fun stuff like that is always really great to do. Back to you, Sharon.
Okay, two things. In our particular town, letters to the editor are pretty carefully screened, and they're more political than they are cause. But we have something else, and I'm sure many cities have this, and rural areas as well. Like Newtown has a Newtown Bee, and we have a Waterbury Observer that gets put onto Facebook a lot of times, and some of the other media. That's a good place to reach out to because they often listen when there's a campaign. The other thing I think we can consider stressing, and it seems to be very important, at least it is to me and my colleague and I, he's very religious, and of course I'm Lutheran, but people have to vote this year. We have to realize who is for sustainable and who is not. And it's, I wish we had a good cartoon, because people will read a cartoon and they may laugh, but they'll see a message instead of feeling like somebody's slapping me in the face again and I'm just not going to listen. And maybe you could do something like that and send it to us, and we can even put it in our own church newsletters.
I love that idea of a cartoon. I'm working on a faith voter guide for North Carolina because I'm in a swing state. We're going to be doing some stuff. I'm going to see if I can find somebody who can make me a good cartoon. I love that. That's awesome.
And please send it on to us because we have.
If I get one, you know I will. I will circle back. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you.
We'll be sure to share your contact information, Amy. And Robert, I'll let you go, but also I want to make sure Amy can get to bed because she's exhausted. And Jane's going to close us with prayer when after you speak, Robert. Go ahead.
I was just going to say about the election thing. LAMPA, or Lutheran Advocacy Ministry in Pennsylvania. Today, what I did for them was I called the Election Bureau in Greensburg to make sure that they had enough volunteers, places to do polling, stuff like that, to make sure that, and to find out what they wanted everybody else in the world to know about what's going on in the election process in Westmoreland County. That was fun.
Thank you for sharing that good news. That's wonderful. And we need a LAMPA in every state, by the way.
Can somebody remind me what that stands for? I've heard of it, but I'm not sure.
Lutheran Advocacy Public Policy.
Lutheran Advocacy Ministries of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. LAMP.
Yeah.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Lisa has more information. We will do our follow-up post with more information and a link directly to what Amy shared. Yeah, and this recording so you can send to other people, and maybe we'll start a accompaniment type of accountability team. Jane, thank you so much. I especially asked you because you're out there in California where it's a little earlier. I see the beautiful light shining on your face. Thank you, Jane, and good to see you.
Well, I'm so excited to think that you might send us some cartoons because I brought that up at our last creation care team. And they always turn to me and say, you have all these ideas and you never come through. So please help me. Yeah. Wouldn't it be great to have it a different cartoon in the bulletin every month during our season of creation or, something like that? That's what my idea was.
That's a good idea to ask our artist friends.
Yeah. So shall I close in prayer?
Yes,
Yeah,
and
okay.
I will also say too, thank you so much, Amy, and have a wonderful, restful night's sleep. And thank you all for being here. Over to you, Jane. Thanks for closing us.
Yeah, well, thank you, Phoebe and Amy and Gabrielle. It's really wonderful to have your work. So let's take a deep breath. Good and gracious and generous God, you continue to provide us with abundance and you nurture us in the midst of our ignorance and apathy and greed. And we're so thankful that you brought us together. We're so thankful for the work of Amy and for the GreenFaith, those that worked on this report. Hold us hold us in prayer as we work together with courage and insight and energy to bring the world that you would like us to bring, and that we always think of those that will come behind us, that we work towards a good and sustainable future. Amen.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody. It's been a
you.
pleasure.